Okay, reading out of the Barbri commercial outline for first year law students, contracts and sales. Page 97 is where we find ourselves, section 8, remedies. Discussing first non-monetary remedies. When we get around to monetary remedy damages, we'll be on page 101. And we'll get to restitution on page 110. So sit tight. We have 13 pages of remedies, non-monetary and monetary. For non-monetary remedies, there are two broad branches of remedies available in breach of contract situations. These are non-monetary and monetary, as discussed already. The primary non-monetary remedy for exam purposes is specific performance. But Article 2 has a number of other specific non-monetary remedies for certain situations involving contracts for the sale of goods. Okay, so specific performance is number 1. If the legal remedy is inadequate, the non-breaching party may seek specific performance, which is essentially an order from the court to the breaching party to perform or face contempt of court charges. The legal remedy damages, in parentheses, generally is inadequate when the subject matter of the contract is rare or unique. The rationale is that if the subject matter is rare or unique, damages will not put the non-breaching party in as good a position as performance would have, because even with the damages, the non-breaching party would not be able to purchase substitute performance. Now, this is available for land and rare or unique goods. Specific performance is always available for land sale contracts because all land is considered to be unique. It is also available for goods that are rare or unique at the time performance is due, which is, for example, rare paintings, gasoline in short supply because of oil embargoes, etc. B, it is not available in the specific performance that is available for breach of contract to provide services, even if the services are rare or unique. This is because of problems of enforcement. It would be difficult for the court to supervise the performance, and because the court feels it is tantamount to involuntary servitude, which is prohibited by the Constitution. Surprisingly, they're not giving you an example there. The fact is, the court can't force somebody to perform a service for you, because you're probably not going to do it well, and the court doesn't want to be involved with that. So, 1, injunction as alternate remedy. In contrast, a court may enjoin a breaching employee from working for a competitor throughout the duration of the contract if the services contracted for are rare or unique. This is allowed because less court supervision is required for a negative injunction than for a specific performance decree. In the prohibition against working, as opposed to the requirement of working, does not run afoul of the Constitution. The rationale for this approach is that an employee providing rare or unique services expressly or impliedly covenants that she will not work for a competitor during the contract term. So that's how you get them. C, under specific performance, is the covenant not to compete. Most courts will grant an order of specific performance to enforce a contract not to compete if Roman numeral 1, the services to be performed are unique, thus rendering money damages inadequate, and Roman numeral 2, the covenant is reasonable. To be reasonable, you have to meet Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3. 1. The covenant must be reasonably necessary to protect the legitimate interest of the person benefited by the covenant. For example, an employer or the purchaser of a covenantor's business. And Roman numeral 2, the covenant. So this is again to be reasonable. The covenant not to compete must be reasonable as to its geographic scope and duration, i.e., it cannot be broader than the benefited person's customer base and typically cannot be longer than 1 or 2 years. And 3, the covenant must not harm the public. So, for example, a locksmith agrees to sell his shop to a competitor and agrees not to open a new locksmith shop within 75 miles of his old shop within the next year. The covenant not to compete probably will be upheld. Equitable defenses available. D. This is specific performance. Because specific performance is an equitable remedy, it is subject to equitable defenses. The most frequently claimed equitable defenses are laches, which means unclean hands, and sale to a bona fide purchaser. So, laches, I forgot how to pronounce it. 1 is 1 under the equitable defenses available. 2 is unclean hands. Okay, so laches does not mean unclean hands. And 3, sale to a bona fide purchaser. So there you go. You have 3 equitable defenses available. Because specific performance is an equitable remedy. Laches. The equitable defense of laches arises when a party delays in bringing an equitable action and the delay prejudices the defendant. For example, the delay has substantially increased the cost or difficulty of performance. Note that mere delay itself is not a ground for this defense. 2 is unclean hands. The unclean hands defense arises when the party seeking specific performance is guilty of some wrongdoing in the transaction being sued upon. For example, the defendant entered into the contract because of plaintiff's lies. Note that the wrongdoing must be related to the transaction being sued upon. It is not sufficient that the plaintiff has defrauded other persons in similar transactions. And third, equitable defense is if the subject matter of a goods or land contract has already been sold to another who purchased for value and in good faith. For example, a bona fide purchaser, the right to specific performance is cut off. For example, store contracts to sell a specific Van Gogh painting to Ben. Before store delivers the painting to Ben, Carla, who is unaware of Ben's contract with store, offers to buy the same Van Gogh from store. Store accepts Carla's offer and gives the painting to Carla. Ben may not obtain specific performance. So again, we're under remedies. So non-monetary remedies under Article 2 starts with A, the buyer's non-monetary remedies. These include cancellation, 1. 2, buyer's right to replevy identified goods. 3, buyer's right to specific performance. So, for cancellation, if a buyer rightfully rejects goods because they do not conform to the contract, one of her options is simply to cancel the contract. Buyer's right to replevy identified goods. Number 2, under non-monetary remedies for the buyer, you have A and B. A, on buyer's prepayment, and B, on buyer's inability to cover. So, if a buyer has made at least part payment of the purchase price of goods that have been identified under a contract and the seller has not delivered the goods, the buyer may replevy the goods from the seller in 2 circumstances. Roman numeral 1, the seller becomes insolvent within 10 days after receiving the buyer's first payment. or Roman numeral 2, the goods were purchased for personal, family, or household purposes. In either case, the buyer must tender any unpaid portion of the purchase price to the seller. And this is in the UCC in section 2-502. B of the buyer's right to replevy identified goods is on the buyer's inability to cover. In addition, the buyer may replevy undelivered identified goods from the seller if the buyer, after reasonable effort, is unable to secure adequate substitute goods, which is the meaning of cover. And we're given a citation here for UCC 2-7163, and I don't know if that's for cover, or if it is probably for cover, or substitute goods, I'm not sure. Buyer and seller enter into a contract for the delivery of 10,000 widgets on December 31st. Seller, who has identified goods to the contract. Example, seller has set aside 10,000 widgets on his loading dock, refuses to deliver. The seller who has identified those goods has refused to deliver. Buyer makes reasonable efforts to find widgets from another source, but the earliest delivery date he can arrange is March 15th. The widgets are needed for buyer's manufacturing operations in February and March. The buyer can replevy the goods from the seller. However, if the widgets were not to be used by buyer until June, widgets for March 15th delivery would probably be reasonable substitute goods, and buyer could not recover the widgets from the seller. And third, under the non-monetary remedies available to the buyer, is the buyer's right to specific performance. A right closely related to the buyer's right to replevy is her right to specific performance where the goods are unique or in other proper circumstances. The court may order specific performance even where the goods have not yet been identified to the contract by the seller. The comments to section 2-716 say that inability to cover is strong evidence of other circumstances. Thus, buyers in inability to cover situations have the choice of replevin or specific performance remedies. Of course, a specific performance remedy is always discretionary with the court, and unclean hands, latches, etc. might bar an equity action but would not affect a replevin recovery. In any case, keep in mind that replevin will lie only for identified goods, while specific performance may be decreed even though the goods have not previously been identified. Seller's non-monetary remedies. So we're at page 100 here. The seller's non-monetary remedies include the seller's right to withhold goods, seller's right to recover goods, the right to demand assurances. So we're going to get through this. If a buyer fails to make a payment due on or before delivery, the seller may withhold delivery of the goods. The seller may also withhold goods when the goods are sold on credit, and before the goods are delivered, the seller discovers that buyer is insolvent. However, in such a case, the seller must deliver the goods if the buyer tenders cash for their payment. Totally remember reading that from UCC 2-702. Sellers, okay, so this is number 2 under seller's non-monetary remedies. After their right to withhold goods comes the right to recover goods. A, right to recover from buyer on buyer's insolvency. B, right to recover shipped, restored goods from Bailey. And that's all she wrote. On buyer's insolvency, a seller may stop delivery of goods in the possession of a carrier or other bailee when he... Okay, I messed that up. When he... Alright, let's just go back to the seller's rights to recover goods. A, the right to recover from buyer on buyer's insolvency. If a seller learns that a buyer has received delivery of goods on credit while insolvent, the seller may reclaim the goods upon demand made within 10 days after the buyer's receipt of the goods. However, the 10-day limitation does not apply if a misrepresentation of insolvency has been made in writing to the particular seller within 3 months before delivery. Note that the seller's right to reclaim the goods is subject to the rights of a buyer in the ordinary course or any other good faith purchaser. Right. So, B, under the seller's right to recover goods, is right to recover shipped or stored goods from the bailee, which one is upon the buyer's insolvency. 1. The seller may stop delivery of goods in the possession of a carrier or other bailee when he discovers the buyer to be insolvent. Of course, the seller must deliver the goods if the buyer tenders cash for their payment. And on the buyer's breach, the seller may stop delivery of carload, truckload, plane load, or larger shipments of goods when the buyer breaches the contract or when the seller has a right to withhold performance pending receipt of assurances. And all that's under section 2-705. 3. When goods may not be stopped, and 4. Obligation of carrier or bailee. So the seller may stop delivery of the goods to the buyer until the buyer receives Roman numeral 1, the goods or a negotiable document of title covering the goods, or 2, Roman numeral 2, an acknowledgement from the bailee other than the carrier that it is holding the goods for the buyer. And fourth, which is under the right to recover shipped or stored goods from the bailee, we see obligation of carrier or bailee. The seller's notification must come in time to give the person in possession a reasonable time to stop delivery. If a negotiable document covers the goods, the carrier or bailee is not obligated to obey a stop order until the document is surrendered. Number 3, seller's ability to force goods on buyer limited. The seller's ability to force goods on a buyer is limited to an action for price when the seller is unable to resell the goods to others at a reasonable price. So that's the third option under the seller's right to recover. No, that's the third option in the seller's non-monetary remedies. First being the seller's right to withhold, then the right to recover, and now the ability to force the goods on the buyer. So, right to demand assurances is C under the remedies. Non-monetary remedies, which I believe is for the seller, so right. Unless I guess it applies to both because the seller asks the buyer for assurances, so that's why it's C. It applies to them both, but it's a non-monetary remedy. So, under Article 2, actions or circumstances that increase the risk of non-performance by a party to the contract but do not clearly indicate that performance will not be forthcoming and may be treated immediately as an anticipatory repudiation, period. May not be treated immediately as an anticipatory repudiation. Go figure. Instead, if there are reasonable grounds for insecurity with respect to the other party's performance, a party may demand assurances that the performance will be forthcoming at a proper time. The demand for assurances must be made in writing. Until the party receives adequate assurances, he may suspend his own performance. This is all discussed within the UCC section 2-609. If the proper assurances are not given within a reasonable time, which is usually 30 days after a justified demand for assurances, he may then treat the contract as repudiated. What constitutes an adequate assurance depends on the facts of the case. For example, and we have 3. Seller hears a rumor, in fact false, that buyer is in financial trouble. Seller reasonably believes that the rumor may have foundation in fact. He is justified in making a demand for assurances and withholding any goods for which he has not been paid. Buyer, within a reasonable time, sends a financial report from her banker showing good financial condition. This is adequate assurance that seller must resume performance. 2. Same facts as above, except buyer is in bad financial condition. Adequate assurances may require a third party of good credit to back up the buyer. And 3rd, same facts as above, buyer does not give any assurances, that seller may treat the failure to give assurances as a repudiation of the contract. So I'm at the bottom of page 101, and we're about to go into monetary remedy.